Hello everyone, welcome to Hopeful Moments 1. Today, we will hear the story about Karen's greed, which led to a family dispute, causing a rift between my grandmother and my father, as well as among the family members. Today's story will take you into an unexpected situation. After losing the lawsuit and failing to claim ownership of my grandmother's property, Karen couldn't achieve what she had desired for many years. This forced her to face her first ever failure, something she had never experienced before. Even more surprising, after my grandmother passed away, despite wanting to own the wooden house, Karen lost interest and stopped spending time there. Not being able to own the property, along with the loss of my grandmother, left Karen feeling bitter, preventing her from continuing to stay attached to the space she had once yearned for. If you find this story interesting and full of meaningful lessons, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more valuable lessons. Karen, who believed she had the right to inherit my father's property, began by attempting to seize that property. Before diving into the details of the story, I want to provide some basic information about inheritance laws in my country. I apologize for not being able to use the exact legal terms in English, as this story takes place in a non-English speaking country. Therefore, I will try to explain everything in the clearest and most understandable way possible. In my country, the inheritance system has very clear and strict regulations about property ownership after someone passes away, especially when the deceased has real estate. If you own a piece of land, you cannot freely sell or decide how to use that land, even if your spouse has passed away, unless you have fulfilled the obligations to direct heirs, which are your children. To explain further, let's say you and your spouse jointly own a large piece of land and you have 3 children. When your spouse passes away, you may intend to sell the land to use the money from the sale. However, before selling, you must ensure that each child's inheritance has been paid. This inheritance must be based on the market value of the property, meaning the actual value of the land at the time of sale. Once you have fulfilled the inheritance payment to the children, you can freely decide to sell, rent, or transfer the land. This means that if you have not fulfilled this obligation or have not divided the inheritance among the children, you are not allowed to sell the land. This law is designed to protect the rights of the heirs and ensure that the property is not dispersed or abused before the legitimate heirs receive their share. Therefore, the inheritance process is not just about dividing assets according to the wishes of the owner, but a legal process involving oversight, fairness, and protection of the family members' rights, especially the children of the deceased. Now, let's get into the story. The story begins with a small wooden house that my grandmother and her 2 sisters had jointly owned for many years. This wooden house not only had value as property but was also a place filled with wonderful family memories. However, everything changed in 2006 when my grandmother's oldest sister passed away. Upon her passing, her share of the property, including the wooden house that the 3 sisters co-owned, was transferred to her children, who were my father's cousins. Although they were an important part of the family, they are not the main characters in this story, as the focus is on my grandmother, my father, and especially my grandmother's younger sister, Karen. Karen, the youngest sister in the family, was considered the princess of the family, always treated specially and loved by everyone. She had a very charming and sweet personality, but at the same time, she was very determined and sometimes selfish. Karen married a wealthy man and thus always lived in luxury and comfort, accustomed to controlling everything and having everything her way. This sense of entitlement had deeply ingrained itself in her character, and she was used to getting what she wanted without much opposition. Karen loved the wooden house that my grandmother and her sisters had co-owned. Every weekend, she would spend time there, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. To her, this wooden house was not just a property, it was a place to find peace for her soul. However, my father's cousins were not interested in selling their share of the property, as they had their own plans and lives. They didn't feel the need to do anything with the property, nor did they plan to sell it. But for Karen, things were different. Karen had longed to own my grandmother's share of the property. She saw this wooden house as a precious asset and believed that if she could fully own it, her life would be much easier and more comfortable. Although my father's cousins were not interested in selling, Karen worked tirelessly to try to convince my grandmother to transfer her share of the property. Even though my grandmother and my father rarely visited the wooden house, she always made sure to contribute to the maintenance and repair costs. She cared about preserving the property, although she couldn't always find the time to visit. Although her contributions might not have been large, they reflected her attachment and concern for the wooden house. Karen, with her intelligent and persuasive nature, noticed the weaknesses in how my grandmother managed the property and began to plan to seize her share. What seemed like a harmonious family relationship began to reveal cracks, creating tension and unexpected challenges. Another noteworthy point about my grandmother is that she had never had to deal with financial issues. Throughout her life, she avoided making financial decisions and never had to worry about managing assets or taxes. All financial matters and property-related issues were handled by my grandfather. He took care of everything in the family, from real estate transactions to taxes and necessary expenses. Therefore, my grandmother rarely had to worry about these complex issues and focused on other family responsibilities. However, my grandfather had passed away a few years before this situation occurred, leaving my grandmother with many anxieties and uncertainties. She was not capable of handling complicated financial matters, so my father had to take on all the responsibility related to the family property and inheritance issues. This put my father in a very difficult position, having to take on the role that my grandfather had always held. My grandmother, being cautious and worried, was unable to adapt to making important financial decisions. In fact, she had never distributed the inheritance she should have passed on to my father from my grandfather's estate. This wasn't because she intentionally avoided it, but simply because she didn't know what to do and lacked confidence in her financial management skills. My father had always been the one to handle everything, even though he never wanted to bear that full responsibility. However, my grandmother was someone who valued family harmony above all, and she didn't want to disrupt any relationships, which is why she trusted my father to handle these matters. Karen, my grandmother's sister, was very skilled in this area. She fully understood my grandmother's situation and her weaknesses when it came to managing finances, and she took advantage of that to execute her own plans. In the winter of 2006, when tensions in the family were at their peak, Karen decided to visit my grandmother. This was a surprise and quite unusual because she had never stayed overnight at my grandmother's house before. Karen was always busy with her own life, and each time she visited, she would only stay for a few hours before leaving in a hurry. But this time, she stayed overnight, which was something my grandmother had never experienced. This really made my grandmother a bit uneasy because she couldn't understand why Karen was acting this way. She sensed a strange change in her sister's behavior, which made her feel uncomfortable. A few days after Karen left, my father called my grandmother as usual to chat. When he heard about Karen's visit, she mentioned that they had a long conversation and reached an agreement about the house. She said that Karen had brought some documents for her to sign, and she had agreed without thinking much. Initially, she thought it was just a routine paperwork, as she didn't fully understand what she was signing. However, when my father heard this, he immediately sensed something was wrong. He felt that something was off, and with his intuition, he immediately asked, "What kind of papers were they? Was it the house ownership certificate?" When my grandmother confirmed it was the house ownership certificate, my father immediately realized that Karen had taken advantage of my grandmother's naivety to carry out a shady deal. And so, everything started to unravel. Karen, with her sharp mind and controlling personality, had exploited my grandmother's lack of understanding of finances to arrange a deal that benefited her, without considering the family's interests. My grandmother, despite sensing that something was wrong, still trusted Karen and signed the papers without realizing that she was unknowingly transferring property ownership to the sister she had always loved. This was the beginning of a tense struggle within the family, where greed and schemes started to weaken family relationships. My grandmother shared that Karen visited and said she wanted to buy her part of the property. She had prepared all the necessary documents and was just waiting for her signature to finalize the transaction. Karen asked my grandmother about the sale price, and my grandmother confidently suggested an amount she thought was reasonable. However, it's important to note that my grandmother, with her naivety and lack of financial knowledge, didn't realize the true value of the house. She had lived in a world where money and property value were not her main concerns, so she couldn't guess that she was being taken advantage of. Nevertheless, she proposed a price of $3,000, an amount she thought was fair. This was an incredibly small sum and nowhere near the actual value of the property. Her calculation was based on a vague feeling of what she thought was enough, without realizing that it was only a tiny fraction of the house's true worth. In reality, that $3,000 was nowhere near the house's actual value. This shocked my father when he heard the story from my grandmother. However, Karen, with her sharp intellect and subtle skills, had exploited my grandmother's ignorance to strike a deal that benefited her. Not only did she offer a price that was absurdly low, but she also carried out everything in secrecy. It was a very sophisticated manipulation. Karen did everything in the shadows, as if she wanted to outsmart everyone, especially my father. She never gave my grandmother the time to think or consult anyone about such an important decision. My grandmother, being kind-hearted and timid, had gotten caught up in a power game she didn't even recognize. What was even more concerning was that Karen didn't just bring the ownership certificate but ensured that my grandmother wouldn't have a chance to seek anyone's advice, especially my father's. She stayed overnight, creating a tense and uncomfortable atmosphere that prevented my grandmother from calling my father to discuss the matter. These details made things even more serious. Karen staying overnight was no accident, it was a psychological strategy. She knew very well that if my grandmother could call my father, everything could stop, and her plan would fail. Therefore, Karen strategically imposed her presence, creating a situation where my grandmother had no choice but to sign the papers. She had pulled her into a power game from which she couldn't escape. Karen not only acted with an exploitative mindset but also showed a complete lack of respect for the family, for my grandmother, who had loved and cared for her all these years. When my father found out about everything, he couldn't contain his anger. He felt betrayed and furious about the injustice that Karen had caused. The first thing my father realized was the stark difference between the value of the house and the price Karen suggested. He couldn't accept that such a valuable asset was being undervalued. Secondly, what angered him even more was Karen's behavior. She not only exploited my grandmother's naivety but also carried out everything secretly and suspiciously, preventing my father, who truly understood the value of the property, from intervening. The fact that Karen chose to stay overnight and didn't allow my grandmother to consult anyone was an act of complete disrespect and selfishness. My father's reaction was completely understandable. For him, this wasn't just a financial matter, it was a betrayal within the family. This was a struggle not just for material gain but also for ethics and respect among family members. From here, my father knew he had to act immediately to protect the family's interests and stop this abuse from continuing. My father never opposed selling my grandmother's part of the property to Karen, but he insisted that the sale price must reflect the market value. This was something Karen was well aware of. My father was very practical and fair, so he couldn't accept the family property being sold at such a low price in a secretive and non-transparent manner. Karen knew my father would never agree to that price, but she tried to push things forward as if once my grandmother signed the papers, everything would be settled. My father immediately realized this wasn't just a family agreement, it had turned into a power struggle. He immediately called Karen and made it clear that this was unacceptable and he would sue her for the illegal sale of the property. Karen, with her overconfidence and stubbornness, refused to take responsibility for her actions. She insisted to my father that everything was the will of my grandmother, that she had independently decided the value of the property, and that she hadn't done anything wrong. But in her justification, Karen was completely unaware of the seriousness of her actions, or perhaps she was so accustomed to being indulged that she no longer feared the painful consequences that lay ahead. Her arrogant attitude only fueled my father's anger. He not only felt betrayed but also deeply insulted by seeing his mother's sister exploit my grandmother, who had always shown her love, for personal gain. My father knew he could not let greed and scheming overshadow the sacred values of family, and this drove him to make a firm decision, ready to fight to the end to defend justice. He immediately hired a lawyer, and Karen did the same. The lawsuit was set to prepare for a long and tense legal battle. Spring and summer passed with continuous struggles between the two sides. My father, with unwavering determination, dedicated all his efforts to protect the family's interests and legacy. He understood that this wasn't just a financial issue, but a fight to defend the honor and rights of the family. Meanwhile, Karen, despite having no legal rights in this matter, remained adamant about asserting her claim. She refused to acknowledge that her actions were a blatant violation of both the law and ethics. Her persistence reflected greed and a sense of entitlement, as though she had a greater right than anyone else to this property. The entire family was caught up in this dispute. My grandmother, a kind woman who had always valued family, felt heartbroken witnessing the greatest conflict within her own family. To her, a dispute among family members was the worst thing that could happen. She had spent her whole life maintaining family harmony, but now she couldn't stop the rift. She begged my father to forgive Karen, not wanting the family to fall apart. However, my father, despite knowing this would break her heart, remained determined not to give up. This was his legacy, and he couldn't let Karen's greed and scheming take it away. His decision, though difficult, was necessary to protect justice and fairness within the family. At the beginning of 2007, the case was finally brought to court. The legal battle had come to an end, and the whole family awaited the court's ruling. The trial lasted only a few hours, but what happened in the courtroom was unforgettable. According to my parents, the judge didn't hesitate to punish Karen severely. The sale of the property was a clear violation of the inheritance laws of our country, and the final ruling declared the sale contract void. The ownership of the house was returned to my grandmother. My mother said that when Karen entered the courtroom, she was very confident, as if she was there to claim her legal rights. However, as the judge reviewed the documents and asked questions, Karen's attitude began to falter. She couldn't provide convincing answers, and eventually, she had no choice but to lower her head and accept her humiliating defeat. A week after the trial, my grandmother passed away. Karen did not attend the funeral, which only made the family feel colder and sadder. From being a close family member, Karen had become a stranger in the eyes of the family, especially my father. Previously, Karen and my father were very close, but after this incident, they never spoke again. After my grandmother's death, my father wanted to sell his share of the property, but he swore he would never sell it to Karen. This decision was non-negotiable, and for my father, it was a principle that couldn't be violated. He contacted his cousins, explained the entire situation, and offered to sell them his share at a fair price. Fortunately, they understood the circumstances and were willing to purchase it at a fair price. After the failure in court and my grandmother's passing, Karen seemed no longer interested in the small house. This was what she had always wanted to own, and for the first time in her life, she couldn't get what she wanted. Clearly, this failure was bitter for Karen. She had tried everything to seize what she believed was hers, but in the end, it was in someone else's hands. This story doesn't have a happy ending, only a profound message that greed and entitlement can ruin not only a person's prospects but also break family relationships. This is a cautionary tale about the importance of fairness, respect, and honesty in the family, as these values form the foundation of every lasting relationship. The property dispute between Karen and my family is a profound lesson about the values of justice, respect, and greed. Although Karen had schemes and selfish actions to seize the family property, in the end, she had to pay the price for her lack of fairness and disregard for the law. Meanwhile, my father, despite facing difficulties and the pain of confronting a family member, remained firm in defending the rights and fairness of the family. The great lesson from this story is, greed and entitlement can destroy everything, from family relationships to opportunities in life. Always respect each other, prioritize justice and ethics, because these are the foundations that help us overcome every challenge without losing ourselves or our family values.